Fear Not, Episode 23. Hi, I'm Billy Atwell, and I believe that consistently facing your fears is the only way to realize your truest self and to make those confident choices that will help you to obtain your deepest held hopes and dreams. I have faith that this podcast series will show you that you are not alone, that it will strengthen you and give you courage to face your fears, and that it will help you to permanently cross over into a life of living beyond your fears. Join me on this journey as we listen and learn from others as they share their experiences in facing and overcoming their own fears. Hello, everybody. Today, you and I are going to be joined by Dr. Andrew Newberg. Welcome, Dr. Newberg. How are you today?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me on your program.
Yeah, thank you. Are you ready? Are you ready to fear not today?
Absolutely.
Dr. Andrew Newberg is the Director of Research at the Myrna Bryan Center of Integrative Medicine at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital and Sidney Kimmel Medical College. He is the author of several books, including the best-selling Why God Won't Go Away, and his research has been featured in Time, Newsweek, and the Oprah magazine, and on the Discovery Channel, the National Geographic Channel, the BBC, and NPR. Dr. Newberg, can you take a few minutes to fill in the gaps and maybe give us a brief glimpse of your personal life?
Sure. So, I actually got interested in this whole topic of sort of studying the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual experiences. Even going back to when I was a kid, I was always asking a lot of questions about how we could understand things in the world, how we understood reality, why there were different religions, and so forth. And as I thought about it initially, I thought, well, science is probably going to be very important in helping us to answer those questions about the nature of reality and how they make sense to us. But as I kind of explored science, and obviously I continue to do science, I love science, but there are certain limitations that it has, and I started to get into a lot of discussions that were more philosophical, theological, even personally contemplative. And so in doing that, I came to realize that we needed something that was really more of a combination of both the scientific approaches and the spiritual approaches to understanding our world, and that ultimately evolved into neurotheology as a field that seeks to understand in more detail that relationship. And part of my career and job is doing brain imaging, and we've done brain imaging studies of all different kinds of neurological and psychological issues and problems that people face: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, depression, so forth. But I was also always interested in, so what's going on in the brain when people have a religious or spiritual experience or do a practice like meditation or prayer? And suddenly I suddenly realized that, well, we could use these same brain studies to not just look at Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, but to look at these kinds of practices or these kinds of experiences. And from there, this whole approach, and at least from my own career, started, and I've been involved in doing it for the last 20 years. And as much work as we've done, we've scanned about 250 people so far or more. There's still just so much more work that needs to be done.
Well, thank you for that glimpse. Can we start off by having you tell us how fear is created and processed in the brain?
Well, fear is basically created for the most part through a combination of things. I mean, first, I suppose one of the main areas of our brain that seems to be associated with fear has to do with our limbic system, the emotional centers of our brain, and in particular a structure called the amygdala. The amygdala basically becomes very active whenever something of motivational importance happens to us in our environment, and that actually can be both good and bad things. So if your spouse or loved one comes into the room, then your amygdala lights up and says, "Oh, this is somebody who I need to pay attention to and interact with." On the other hand, if something very fearful happens, if instead of your loved one coming into the room, a lion walks into the room, then your amygdala lights up and says, "Okay, I gotta be ready to go. I gotta be prepared." That's the traditional fight or flight response. But the limbic system and the amygdala also interact with several other very central structures. One of them is called the hypothalamus, which sits kind of really at the very base of the brain. It regulates a lot of our hormones, but also interacts with our amygdala and is very involved in both positive as well as negative emotions, and may be kind of the most rudimentary part of our nervous system in terms of that fear response. which also is connected to the body. And so we have what's called the autonomic nervous system, And in the autonomic nervous system, we have one part which we refer to as the sympathetic nervous system, which is kind of the arousal system. That is what governs the fight or flight response. And then we have the parasympathetic side, which is more of the calming system of the brain and allows us to relax and rejuvenate our energy stores. So when something fearful happens, the amygdala reacts, our hypothalamus reacts, and our body reacts, all in a very arousing kind of way, so that we pay attention to it and we are looking at what we need to do, whether we flee the flight or whether we choose to stay and try to fight it out. It readies our body. And so what I think is particularly interesting is that fear is something that you not only have a kind of emotional feeling of, but it's something that's visceral as well. And of course, all of us feel that when we watch a scary movie or when something happens, a car cuts us off on the freeway, we feel it in our body. Our heart rate and our blood pressure goes up because that's regulated by the autonomic nervous system, and we get scared. And we get scared because of our limbic system and some of the other areas of our brain that our limbic system is ultimately connected to.
In your book, How God Changes Your Brain, I found it really fascinating, and I know you mentioned it in your sort of when you were filling in the gaps about the perennial scans that you did on both Buddhist and Christian meditations. And it seems to me like this might be the first step in sort of dealing with fear, is to dissolve that sense of self and connect with God or the universe.
Well, there are multiple ways of doing that, and that is one of the ways. I mean, part of what happens, and this this goes back to 2,500 years ago to Buddha, who basically thought that a lot of our suffering and in that regard our anguish and fear comes from the connections, the attachments that we have to our physical self, our ego self, and the world around us. And that if we can meditate and get beyond that self, then we lose that fear. We lose that suffering, because we no longer feel that we're losing something or we're missing something or that something's damaging who we are. And for the individual who has this deep sense of connection to God or the universe, that greater connection, that greater oneness, if you will, is something that kind of pervades the person's entire way of thinking about things. And so they no longer have fears about death, fears about other issues and problems going on in their world, and the evidence points to that. The most recent book I published was called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, and in that book we talk about a survey that we have done that we've been running for about 5 years, where we ask people about their most intense spiritual experiences, their kind of enlightenment experiences. And for the people who have had those experiences, and we've looked at about 2,000 people who hit this website and gave us information. After people have that experience, these are some of the things that they actually describe in a very specific way, that they no longer fear death because they know that they, as an individual, are connected to something greater than the self, so they don't have to fear the individual ego self going away. And getting back to your question, then that sense of connection, that ability to transcend oneself, becomes a very important way of helping to ward off those feelings of fear and anger. And so, I mean, that is certainly one very, very powerful way. Obviously, it's in the context of a religious or spiritual tradition. But there are obviously other ways of trying to mitigate different types of fear reactions. And we're involved in a research study right now where we're looking at an integrated medicine technique that combines things like acupressure and biofeedback and just like a cognitive restructuring process, that for people who have a great deal of fear from emotional traumas, whether they're related to healthcare issues, diagnosis of cancer, whether they're actual literal traumatic events. And this kind of a program has actually been shown to reduce the anxiety and the distress and the fear that comes from reliving that experience, and also changes the way the brain works and changes the way that limbic system, those areas that we were just talking about, the limbic system, the amygdala and so forth, how they interact with each other and how they function to help to support a person in not responding to them in the same way.
Yeah, you sort of said something that sort of triggered a memory about that. It's like in those perennial scans, you were saying it was more than just the chanting or the depending on the particular religion, but there was also a connection with touch and fingers. So I find it fascinating. And I spoke to an acupuncturist about a week ago, and there seems to be a more complex connection between the words and thoughts and actual physical sensation and changing brain pattern and behavior?
Well, certainly. I mean, everything is very interconnected within our bodies and our brains, and so as we, when that fight or flight response kicks in, we have a tendency to feel less pain. We maybe the more obvious examples of these are, the football player who breaks an arm or a leg or something like that and finishes the game. With all of the adrenaline and all of the stress hormones and autonomic nervous system firing away, we don't feel things exactly the same way. So it does change the way we respond, and whether it's through the autonomic nervous system turning on, whether it is through a practice like there's certainly examples of people who have meditated while being burned alive, kind of thing, and so they don't flinch, they don't respond to the pain, and there's some evidence to support that those practices can literally change the way a person's pain perceptions are felt. There are many different ways that we can try to help people reduce that responsiveness to sensory stimuli, and some of them do evoke painful responses or get that limbic system going in one way or another, but there are many different ways of doing it, and I think again that's kind of the larger picture issue, which is that there are many the complex systems in the brain that help us to feel that fear and pain. Those are they are very complex, and they can be affected or altered in many different kinds of ways with many different kinds of programs.
Also, too, in your book, How God Changes Your Brain, and in conjunction is sort of suppressing or addressing fear. I know that you said that the anterior cingulate was also responsible for decreasing fear
Mm.
by suppressing the activity in the amygdala. How do you stimulate the anterior cingulate? I mean, is that just part of the overall process, or is there something specific that you could do, or am I totally off base here?
Well, no, no. I mean, basically, one on a neurophysiological perspective. So you have your frontal lobes, which are very big. They're right behind your forehead. They help to regulate a lot of your emotional responses, and through what's called the anterior cingulate, which is also sort of part of the frontal lobe connects to the limbic system, and it's a little bit of a fulcrum, if you will. So if your frontal lobes are turned on and you're able to kind of concentrate and bring your attention to who you are and to your body, then you can settle down your emotions and your fear responses. On the other hand, when your fear responses go up, then sometimes your frontal lobe activity is suppressed. So it can kind of go both ways. But and that's part of the important aspect of it. Then the question is are there things that you can do to help kind of modulate the system in one way or another? And that is where you ultimately get into things like meditation practices that help to heighten the activity in the frontal lobes that actually has been shown to not only cause that type of change in activity through the brain scans, but then it also alters the way we perceive our sensory systems, how we perceive pain, how we perceive our emotional responses, and we can hence regulate them more effectively, perhaps by doing a practice like meditation. Again, there's other types. There's biofeedback, which can be useful. Hypnosis is another approach. So all of these different approaches can potentially alter activity in the frontal lobes and anterior cingulate, which then helps to regulate the emotional responses. And so, if you practice enough and if you do things enough, then when scary things happen to you and which would normally elicit a fear response, you can actually reduce the amount of responsivity that your brain has, and hence reduce your fear response.
Thank you. Thank you for that information. Um, Also, you mentioned the book How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, which is really good, actually. I just finished reading it.
Well, thank you.
But one of the things that well, there were two things that I found fascinating. The first was the difference between small e and big E, E referring to enlightenment. So that was really clarifying, and I think important. But the bigger question I have for you is because you were talking about infinite doubt and your personal quest on figuring this out. And since doubt is such an integral part of fear,
Mm.
could you possibly explain it? Because I know one of the things that I found fascinating is that you said that you stopped at the end of your sort of journey of this is that you stopped fighting the doubt and you just sort of became one with it.
Right. Well, yes. I mean, so as we talked about a little earlier on, I mean, part of my own personal pathway was was to do something contemplative, and I was really exploring within my own mind my perceptions of reality and my perspectives on reality. And I decided to take a sort of an approach where I said, well, unless I could really be certain about something, I would simply say that this was something that fell into what I would refer to as like a realm of doubt. And the experience that you mentioned was one which basically everything wound up going in there, and so I refer to it, for lack of a better word, as infinite doubt, where basically just everything is just doubted forever. And as on one hand, when I spoke to my co-author Mark Waldman, and I told him about this experience I had, he said, that must have been kind of a horrible experience. It must have been very frightening and scary, and something that must have been really, unpleasant, because here you are trying to find answers, and now you basically have come to the conclusion that there are no answers. And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, well, what was interesting about it was that actually it was not like that at all. It was actually something in which it felt enormously comforting and very calming. And as you mentioned, it was something where I kind of surrendered to that doubt, so that I didn't have to fear not finding an answer anymore. And it was kind of a weird paradoxical experience, where I just didn't feel like I felt like it was okay to have that doubt now, and everything kind of fit into that. And so I no longer had to fear not knowing, and no longer had to fear all of the questions and the striving to understand that I had before. And in that regard, it was a very sort of powerful, transcending experience for myself that set me up really to begin to explore these questions even in more detail, but coming along with the idea that I didn't need to know the answer to them. So it sort of took that angst and that fear and that discomfort away, so that I could just explore the world the way I wanted to, and I didn't have to worry about it anymore. And I think in that regard, it was a very powerful experience for me, and it was something that made it easier for me to continue to pursue the work that I've been doing in my career.
Yeah, it seemed the first impression that I got when I read that it would seem like it would have been a sense of relief.
Right, right. Well, it was in many ways, and since then, I continue to try to understand what it means, and basically where you can go from there. And I think there are some ways in which I might be able to go, but I'm still working on this. And as I
Yeah.
always tell people, I'll let everybody know if I ever figure it all out. But at the moment, there's still a lot of questions and a lot of doubt that remain.
So when you're approached by fear or doubt, I should say,
Mm.
what is your attitude? Do you just say, "Oh, I know this is fear, nice try," or I mean, how do you specifically approach these things when they come to you?
Well, I mean, when it comes to fear in the context of these thought processes and the concerns that I have, the angst that I have, yes, I mean, part of the answer is that I don't have that level of fear that I did before. It's something that I seem to be able to understand now in a new context, in which it's okay to have doubt and to have questions. And in fact, part of the answer, I think, is something that I refer to as a passion for inquiry. That we, as long as you keep asking questions, then you keep going down the path. And so I think, to me, the only time I would actually start to fear things is if I stopped asking questions. But so that's part of it. And then, but I think the other thing is a realization and an appreciation for just the way our bodies work, and that it's okay that we can have feelings of fear. That we're built that way. There's reasons for that, and it's supposed to help us. It's supposed to teach us something about the world around us, and make sure that we navigate through the world properly as best as we can. So fear in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's a very necessary thing to make sure that you don't fall off a cliff or go too close to a predator or something like that. I mean, that's how our brains are designed and developed. So feeling those feelings of fear in and of itself is not really the problem. It's just a matter of where that feeling takes you, and whether it incapacitates you or it becomes something that you can use in a more constructive way.
Yeah, I think I have to agree, and I think because of some of my own research, particularly in the Christian doctrines, it's like fear is natural, but it's your response that
Right.
determines whether what you do. And I think the word actually "fear not" means just not to run
Mm.
in the Christian term, from what
Yeah. Well,
my understanding.
and as you said, I mean, in many traditions, and Christian in particular, I mean, the fear of God is sort of, I mean, there should be, to some degree. I mean, I mean, you're talking about us as being very finite, very limited, just suddenly having an interaction with something which is so beyond us. It is, there's a scary element to that. And so there's a naturalness to that kind of a feeling, and that's okay. I mean, that's part of what that experience is about. But as you said, it's what you do with that, and do you flee or do you embrace in some way and try to work through that? And that obviously is the difference between somebody who winds up going down a path that is very comforting and something that can be useful and constructive in their life versus going down a path that ultimately becomes very negative and very destructive.
Do you have any parting advice for us today, something that we might integrate into our own journeys in dealing with fear?
Well, I think part of it is to explore the different pathways. I think one of the things that that is important for people to realize, and apropos of what we just talked about, is that when the way our brain works is that there's a cute phrase that neurons that fire together wire together, and part of the idea behind that is the notion that if you live in fear and if you continually focus on fear, then those are the neural connections that that form in the brain, and so you wind up living a very fearful kind of life. And there's evidence to show that that people who live in that kind of a state, that they're constantly sort of unable to embrace novel environments because they just they're always in fear. Whereas if you can try to embrace that fear and turn it into something constructive and positive, and work towards more positive attitudes and emotions, then those are the neural connections that become a part of who you are, and those are the connections that ultimately foster the various behaviors and beliefs in your brain. So for everyone, the idea is that we do have those fear mechanisms in our body and in our brain. They're okay. We can use them effectively, but if we are persistently using them, we use them to the detriment of our ability to function, then we have to be conscious of that, and we have to try to find ways of turning that around, usually through some type of religious or spiritual practice or some other pursuit that gives us in a more positive light.
A restructuring of the brain, sort of, to speak.
Absolutely, and that is one of the good things, that the brain can always change. So that's always good, and we just have to find the most effective ways of doing it.
Thank you. Well, and I want to thank you so much, Dr. Newberg, for joining us today. I really, truly appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me today. And remember, you cannot achieve everything, but you do have the God-given ability to achieve anything. So stay focused, out of fear, and keep on keeping on. Until next time, be well and peaceful. For more information on today's episode and guest, or for resources that will assist you in overcoming your fears, visit livingbeyondyourfears.com. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, where 3 times a week we move to a life beyond our fears.